This is Boise Blackbirds, and today I am here with Maxine Durand, and this is my second time interviewing you. The first time we were outside of an Idaho 5051 rally, and we didn't get a lot of time. I think the Empire Dropouts were playing their bass guitar and kind of cut us off before we got too far into it, but we were also on the side of the street. So I appreciate you coming over here and taking some extra time just so that I can get to know you a bit better, our community can get to know you better, and the communities that I'm involved with, that I care about. Maybe I can answer some questions on behalf of a lot of them who also sent me some questions. So I just kind of want to jump into it, and I will just start by asking you kind of an open-ended question for those who may not know you. Can you just tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you for having me. So I guess a little bit about me. So I've been in public service for, I think this is going on 12 years now. I've worked for 3 different universities. I worked for Idaho Medicaid for a little bit. I've worked for a bunch of different nonprofits and like different volunteer work. I've been on some different boards. It's important to me. I kind of fell into it. I was in journalism school. I graduated at a weird time and I needed a job with health insurance and ended up just falling into like government and nonprofit work. Found out I really liked it and kind of had a knack for it. And it's turned into a whole career since then. Most recently, I worked for the city of Twin Falls. I ran the public transportation system there for its first 2-year run. Really successful. I'm still really proud of the work that me and my team of drivers did out there. And this is, for me, this campaign is sort of about taking the skills and experiences that I have developed over this career of being mostly rank and file public service, like the people that work for a living, and taking some of those insider experiences to the public, but also, advocating for people that typically are not in a position to do these kinds of things for themselves.
Excellent. Okay, so kind of more representative of not just like your super career politicians out there that just do it as a day job, but to kind of be representative of those of us out here who are actually workers and whatnot. And you mentioned the Right TFT program, I think you called it, in a previous interview, and I did want to follow up on that because I looked into that afterwards, and I was just so impressed by that because
Thank you.
That's like one of those real things that I think a community could really benefit from. And after I saw what it was, I was like, we could use that here. And I was looking at lifts just to get a friend to work at one point, and it was like $18 to get them a lift to work. And I'm like, it makes a lot of sense what Twin Falls has. So I'm like, man, I wish Boise would kind of look into something like that. So that alone, is there anything else experience-wise or whatnot? You went to a few Idaho colleges and you went to school for journalism. Those are obviously great things, but is there anything that truly inspired you to run for that governor position? Which I don't think I mentioned specifically, but you are running for governor in the midterms next year. So this is a race that I think a lot of people should be paying attention to, which I don't know if there's a lot of eyes on this right now, but we're talking about the governor of Idaho is up for grabs for next year. So that's what you're running for. What truly maybe inspired you to say that's the seat I want? Because it could be argued that you could run for any political office and still bring all those values to the table, but why the governorship?
Yeah, no, I think that's a fair question, and it's one that I've had a few times before too. So the truth of it is, sitting down and kind of calculating it all out, right? I'm running as an independent candidate. I'm a socialist. I have a very progressive platform. Please take a look, durandforidaho.com. But it's something that, look, you can do a lot of good running for like your local city council or county commissioner seats. And I advocate for that. Especially when I was working for a city government, a lot of things that I was dealing with that were struggles would have been made a lot easier if people just went to their council meetings more often. So like, there's a strong argument to be made. But with the platform I'm running on, I feel like it's something that it's important to me to get as many eyes in Idaho on this kind of platform, because regardless of the outcome, I am changing the narrative. I am moving the needle. We're not just talking about like transgender bathroom bills and how conservative we are. There's actually a case to be made for things like, affordable universal housing, a Medicare for all system, fixing public education, right? Like these are things that at best we always seem to just circle around, and it's 3 shades of conservative. And I'm out here saying, hey, like let's lean more towards like the progressive left and into like socialist policies that I think Idaho really needs. And those aren't the kinds of things that you can really advocate for at the city or county level. Those are things that you need to be aiming for a state seat. The other component to that is, if you're going to run for something in Idaho, there's 2 million people in this state. Most of them are clustered in a handful of urban areas. It is not hard to be known to 2 million people. So and like, let's be honest, I'm a transgender woman and a socialist. We actually got featured briefly on Jesse Waters on Fox News. So like, like, let's be real. I know who's going to be talking about me just because I showed up. And if your goal is to be known and run competitively in a state level race, I think that there's a strong argument to be made here. But then the most important thing, Idaho, the way it's set up, as much as conservatives talk about being about small government, they take a lot of power away from their cities and counties and do things at the state level in Idaho. So if you really want to try and actually have influence in as much area in Idaho as you can for the kinds of things that I'm advocating for, state level positions and the governorship start to seem really appealing. I also think that, frankly, I would do a much better job than Brad Little.
Okay. Well, I agree with every single point, especially the last one on just kind of your purpose for running for governor. And I definitely think that I would agree with you. I mean, we need these policies all the way at the top down. And I know a lot of people are kind of sensitive to hearing the word socialist and, having something new, but I personally find it very refreshing, and it made me eager to want to get to know you more, just because, yeah, we haven't seen anything like that in Idaho, and I don't think what's working.
Not for 100 years.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I'm definitely not 100 years old, so I haven't seen it.
Well, we used to have, it was the Idaho Socialist Party about 100 years ago.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, so we're actually still doing some research on this internally with my staff. But yeah, about 100 years ago, it was the Idaho Socialist Party. They were part of the original progressive movement. Do some homework on that, because that's where a lot of these initial pushes for things like, the 8-hour workday and like 40-hour work week, like those kinds of things started to really gain traction. It's also a big influence on like my profession of public administration. Ultimately, like the modern profession pretty much comes straight out of the progressive movement. So really, like I've made the joke before, because we've talked about like my campaign ultimately leveraging into becoming a new socialist party in Idaho. And we're working on that. We'll probably have some announcements coming out here probably in the next few months. But like, we're not reinventing the wheel here. We're just kind of putting air back into the tire, right? So, we're the first ones to do this, but just for a while, not the first ever.
Yeah, okay, yeah. All right, well, let's jump into some of the topics.
Sure.
And I did take a look at durandforidaho.com, and it took me a while to finally make it to the site and dive into these policies and whatnot, but I definitely was very impressed, and I have a lot of questions. I'm sure a lot of people do who have been to the website, but let's first talk about healthcare.
Yep.
And let's talk about the big one first, which is universal care. And you talk about Medicare and Medicaid expansion,
Mm-hmm.
talk about no co-pays or premiums or deductibles. And I gotta say, I just did my enrollment, as I'm sure a lot of people are either in the middle of right now or have done before. And with the enrollment, it was traumatic for me. I'm gonna be honest with you. I mean, I don't make a lot of money, but it was after I went to yourhealthidaho.gov and put in my income and whatnot. It was telling me that it would give me an $11 credit semi-monthly, so $22 a month was my credit. But my premiums, my monthly payments would be at minimum for the smallest package, $600 a month. And I'm just sitting there thinking, I've never used healthcare. I mean, I've never used it. I've been healthy. I try and keep myself healthy. And they're asking $600 a month, which is a lot more than what I was paying currently. So it scared me. And I know a lot of people are having a lot of fear around spending that kind of money right now in this climate. So the thought of, healthcare for all sounds amazing. And I think a lot of people really perk up at that idea, but they don't know how that works. They don't know how you intend to do that. And they just have a lot of questions about, is this like a pipe dream? Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, and I mean, I'll start by saying too, like, your experience is sadly not a unique one, right? I think most Americans, if not all of us at this point, have had a similar, very negative and very traumatizing experience with healthcare. I don't think it's a pipe dream. I wouldn't advocate for it if I did feel that way. And like, I worked for Idaho Medicaid for a while. Like, these systems already exist for a certain section of the population, right? Like Medicaid is meant for like a handful of specific diseases and for younger people or people below the poverty line. And then Medicare is for people over the age of, I think, like 65, right? I mean, there's a couple different things in there too. And there's some weird overlaps and niches within both of those, but we have a program of socialized medicine that exists in this country already. All I'm basically saying is, why don't we expand it a little bit? And there's different ways you could do it. Like, one idea I've thought about is maybe, incrementally, like both of those programs just start adding in different brackets and age groups until they kind of meet in the middle, and then it's effectively one universal program. You could do it differently. Like there's Medicare for all, there's universal health care schemes. I mean, there's a bunch of different logistical ways to make it happen. And those are policy decisions that need to be made like as you're writing a bill, and then there's going to be some things that come like the actual administrators that operate these things. The real big question is funding. And that's something too that like I understand, like, you know, people throw the word socialist out there and they think I'm talking about free stuff. It's like, I'm not. I'm talking about using our tax dollars. And so some of that is, hey, maybe we stop giving tax cuts to the wealthy and to, you know, businesses that operate in our state. And that helps shore up some of the deficit that we're now having. Because I keep seeing the number change. What is it, like $58 million in deficit now that we're going to have all of a sudden? And then we're like, well, how did that happen? As if it's a mystery. It's like, no, it's because of tax cuts. I think you can make a lot of inroads by at least, you know, stopping the bleeding by getting rid of tax cuts. And that will bring in some of that revenue that you need to run these social programs like Medicare for All. And as necessary, like increasing new taxes and coming up, or increasing taxes, adding new taxes and coming up with additional funding schemes. This isn't healthcare, but like I have a policy about public transportation. And to fund that, I'm basically talking about adding an extra fee onto when you do your auto registration every year or every 2 years. So that's a new source of revenue. There are opportunities to do things like that that could be used to fund all of these programs: universal health care, transportation, housing, all the things I'm talking about. And so then it's not about it being a pipe dream in the sense of, oh, it can't be done. Like I'm telling you, logistically and administratively, it absolutely can be done. And don't get me wrong, there are problems with the existing systems too, and we need to fix those. But the idea that just because somebody's paycheck says state of Idaho on it, they've somehow had a lobotomy and don't know how to do math. I mean, that's the kind of rhetoric you're hearing from the right. And the truth is, like, I think we should abolish private health insurance. And if we can do that at the state level instead of waiting for the national level to come forward on that issue, I think we should advocate for that. And that's what I'm aiming for.
Excellent. Yeah, I mean, I know just even going to the doctor's office, the thing that doesn't scare me isn't the doctor. It's not the white coat. It's all the paperwork, and it's all the kind of difficult conversation you have with your doctor when someone else has to talk to you about your insurance.
Yep.
And you can't talk to your doctor about whether or not you can afford what they're telling you, so you can't make those decisions. And then you're dealing with the insurance companies, and you're dealing with someone there that's overworked and stressed out trying to figure this out for you. And they have so many of these conversations, they're burnt out, and they just give it to you in the most weakest way possible, and that's not really their fault. So all that confusion with insurance companies.
Well, and that's even just for people who are healthy otherwise and are going because they need treatment.
Yeah.
That's not even talking about like, hey, you had an accident or, you know, you hurt yourself and now there's an ambulance on the way. Yeah. Somebody calling an ambulance for you, that's a good thing to do, but it's also the financial equivalent to a death sentence.
Yes.
So nobody is winning here except for people who own shares in these companies that are basically milking us for every cent they can get.
Great. And the intimidation of dealing with these things leads to legitimate health issues.
Yeah, oh, absolutely. Yeah.
I know that
the stress will kill you before the disease.
I know colon cancer is on the rise in young adults,
mm-hmm.
and even me just going in to get screened for that just as a precaution. They say do it when you're like 45 or whatever, but I'd prefer to do it sooner.
Yep.
But all this I have to deal with and the expenses and everything, it's just a big no, I'll wait. So I appreciate that. You also talked about the decriminalization of cannabis, which I am a big fan of. I've been super vocal and interested in paying attention to the cause of people like Kind Idaho, Legalize Idaho, these groups that are trying to bring that, what I consider medicine, to the state of Idaho. First of all, so we don't just keep giving Oregon millions and millions of dollars. I mean, why not keep that money right here?
Oh, yeah.
But also just because it replaces pharmaceuticals. And I know there's a stigma around it right now just because of how it's always been. That makes it so people are afraid to use it, or stigmatize people who do use cannabis. And I know it has real, legitimate, lasting, positives for health and just mental health, especially for people with PTSD and veterans and whatnot. So decriminalization of weed, what does that mean to you?
Well, and just to clarify too, like not just decriminalization, but like full legalization.
Yeah.
In my ideal world on this issue, you know, you'd be able to buy it at your local head shop just like anything else, and you'd probably pay a tax for that, and then we'd use that tax to fund social programs.
Yeah.
I don't think that any of the hyperbole we've heard about marijuana or cannabis products is valid. I'm not saying that there aren't necessarily some concerns with like, you know, chronic use or extreme use of the product, but like that's pretty rare. And like the social stigma, I mean, talk to anybody younger than like 45, and I don't think you're going to find it. So it's really down to, we've got some people in our government who feel a certain way, and they are making that decision for a population that doesn't agree with them, and they are willing to do whatever it takes to force the issue, to the point where, because they don't want to see marijuana legalized through a ballot initiative, they're trying to get rid of our ability to do ballot initiatives, right? This is not about democracy. This is not about what's best for the population. This is not even about marijuana. This is about control. This is about politics. And so, yeah, I would advocate for full legalization and taxation at the point of sale, so that we can then use that money to fund all the things that people tell me are pipe dreams.
Yeah, excellent. Yeah, I mean, as far as mentioning the HJR4, the removal of the ballot initiative, thanks for bringing that up, because I was going to bring that up. And I think that's a huge infringement on what Idaho values in its ballot initiative process. And they can say it's just for psychoactive substances, but
they're lying.
Why can we make exceptions, you know?
Yeah.
So I definitely appreciate that you are on the side of the people on this one, and kind of recognize that there's just a lot of stigma, and it's not really causing the harm that, you know, maybe some people are saying it is. I do recognize that, you know, children probably shouldn't be having access to this, because then they mess with their brain development.
But that's like always the argument that gets drug out, right?
Yeah,
think of the children.
Think of the children.
And it's like no one is talking about that. No one.
Yeah. And then they're talking about banning edibles, and I think they already did ban edibles. And there's like people out there just trying to sell glass on the streets, and it's like they're little art projects, and you know they're starting a small business, just trying to help people be able to use their medicine, and they're getting rated.
Well, and not to beat a dead horse, but like the national ban on edibles that they snuck into the bill to reopen the government. Like why do you think that happened? The alcohol lobby, largely, right? And so it's, why is it happening? Money, billionaires, people who are trying to corner the market at the expense of regular people like you and me. It's the same old story, to the point where I feel like I must be a conspiracy theorist saying it over and over again. But like, that's where we're at. You know, we've let things in our country, and especially in states like Idaho, get so far to the side of just rampant capitalism and rank profiteering that anything that's not that sounds like extremism.
Yeah, and it's nice to hear someone just talking about it, because I know for a lot of politicians, this would not be something they would even really feel comfortable talking about, but it's what people in my generation have been saying for years, and it's just common sense to us.
Yeah.
Okay, so rural access to hospitals. I've been seeing a lot of people talking about how just because of, you know, budget cuts and because of what's going on in healthcare and whatnot, there's a lot of areas that are being left as healthcare deserts, even especially for women, which we can touch more on later. But just rural communities having access to specifically healthcare, there's just been a lot of concerns about that. What's your attention on that?
Yeah, there's two ways to fix that, right? Part of it is, do you have enough physical locations spread out in the right areas where people can access them? The other part of that is public transit. And I know, obviously, I'm biased because I ran a transit system, but I can tell you this from experience. If you look at the Ride TFT system in Twin Falls, one of the agreements that we got through not long before I left, actually, to run this campaign, we got a partnership with St. Luke's Health System. And so they buy into the program for a set amount, and basically they have a partnership. They're invested with the intent that we'd be expanding the program to help accommodate the needs of not just their patients, but medical transportation within our coverage zone. The reason I bring that up, when we first started having conversations with them about it, they were to the point where they wanted to write us a check just so that we would create a shuttle service for them. And I said, no, if you're going to do that, you should buy in and actually have some skin in this and like be a partner, not a customer, right? If you're looking at these rural areas, and like that area that I worked, Twin Falls, is the hub for a major rural area of the Magic Valley, which I'm from. It's not just, hey, we need micro clinics in all of these communities. That is part of the solution, and you should have more clinics and more doctors, more availability. But also a lot of this could be solved by just having like regular public transportation that is accommodating for people with disabilities and the elderly. And I'm not even just talking about like, it's called NEMT, non-emergency medical transportation. That's a separate classification. You don't even really need that as much if you just have like a regular bus that comes at so many times a day, and people can hop on and get to the hospital, because that's one of the main destinations. It's not everything is a public transit issue, but we used to get invited to a lot of different things because so many things link up with that. If you can provide the infrastructure for people to get to the grocery store, the doctor, the community college, like all of the amenities of their community, suddenly it doesn't matter so much that we're all spread out, because they can access it easily regardless. The other thing you can do for rural health especially is telemedicine. And so that's also why I have part of my platform includes like a telework, like, like commute initiative. I don't go so far into talking specifically about telehealth, but like I'm talking about expanding broadband access so that that becomes more viable. Because if you're out in the sticks, and like I grew up in Richfield, it's about 450, maybe 500 people now. It's gotten a lot better, but there's nothing out there. And so if you can, hop onto your laptop and that saves you an hour to an hour and a half drive to get to like a doctor and like actually have an appointment, you can do it from your laptop in your home. That makes a lot of sense. And not all places like where I grew up have good, reliable internet access, and certainly not necessarily affordable, where they can engage with like medical care at that level. So a couple of different solutions, like I said. So there's the clinic access, there's the transportation, and then there's the telemedicine aspect of it. And I would advocate for all three.
Excellent. Yeah. So just being able to help communicate with these rural areas and also providing the transportation. I mean, yeah, those make sense for rural areas. It's like, yeah, okay, perfect. Another hot topic is caregivers, and this includes, which is, I'm speaking specifically about a lot of people are, because of healthcare issues, they're doing a lot of care in their homes. But we also have issues with caregivers in Idaho, in like nursing homes and like retirement facilities and places like that are just kind of getting abused, to be honest. And it's just people I know specifically too that they're paid very little. There's no training. They're left alone with a lot of times without the proper training to be able to handle these situations. Sometimes they're getting really hurt. And, it's also just a very difficult job to do that I don't think it's enough appreciation. And then during the COVID times, we did have people that were actually paid to be caregivers for their own family members at home, things like that. So just the world of caregiving seems like it's under a lot of stress right now. Do you have any kind of input on that?
Yeah, I actually used to work in that field. And I wasn't paid for this, but like I used to babysit for a family that I'm still very close to. They have a child with Down syndrome. So I've been involved in that a little bit. I also used to work for a facility for adults with developmental disabilities. I worked the graveyard shift, so like 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. and like it was a whole saga in my life. So I could say a bit about this, and I would say there's a few problems. The first is, like you touched on, we don't have enough people that provide care, and that includes not just doctors and nurses, but like just caregivers and like people who can like feed and clothe and give prescription medication, those kinds of things. We do have some programs at the state level here that allow you to like get a certification or like get some kind of like stipend from the state to provide certain services, but they're difficult to access. They're not commonly known to the population, and they don't provide a lot of money. They're also getting cut left and right. So expanding programs like that obviously are a big part of this. But the other component is, when I worked in this field, nobody was getting paid very well. These were like survival wages, and they're charging the families a huge amount of money to provide, even in situations where there's not abuse, and that absolutely happens. So I don't mean to take away from that at all. But even in situations where abuse is not part of the circumstance, you're talking about people that are extremely burnt out. They're exhausted. They are making basically a starvation wage to provide the most intimate care to people who cannot care for themselves. I can't describe to you what it feels like when you've got, like an elderly patient who's not mentally able to really understand what's going on, and you are entrusted with like feeding them, getting them their meds on time, bathing them, right? And like, it's a very special job, and it's not something that everybody is equipped to do, and it takes a lot out of you. And so the idea that, and again, like it's a handful of private companies that run a lot of these facilities, and they're making a lot of money. A lot of them aren't even based in Idaho, but they make money from the client side, from the families, and then they make money from the government side, from like things like Medicaid, Medicare. So they're raking it in, and the people who are actually providing the labor are really not given much to stand on. And so then what kind of care at best can you provide to a patient that needs as much care as you can give when you've barely got enough gas in your tank to get to work in the morning, and you got maybe 2 hours of sleep before you got there? It's a huge like compounding problem. And the only way you can fix it is, partly you can do it through some of the healthcare policies that I've already talked about. But really the ultimate answer is just you need to get rid of the privatization in this field and you need to invest a lot of public dollars into actually providing care.
Okay, excellent. I agree with you on all of that. A couple other things, and you can just touch on these as much as you'd like, but just some other things, again, mentioned by the community and the people I spend my time with here.
Sure.
Let's talk about abortion access, first of all. Support and resources. This is the last state that I think anybody wants to consider being, having an abortion. And I was just at an event where they were talking about, one thing they talk about is life flight insurance, just in case they need to fly you out for your pregnancy, which is just, it seems so crazy to me to have these conversations when you're pregnant, being life flighted out of here and being like paying for the insurance for that. So it's not a surprise cost you. And then we're losing access to, our gynecologists and our doctors and everything. And obviously it's horrible right now.
Yeah.
So, what's your stance on abortion, and what would you do for maybe anybody who is wondering if they should support you if they are, pro-choice?
Abortion's about bodily autonomy. I am pro-abortion for the same reason that I am pro-trans healthcare. I'm pro-reproductive healthcare. These are decisions that are made between a patient and their doctor, and those are the only people that should be involved in that conversation. It is not a place for uninformed elected officials to intervene. That is something that, I've had enough experiences with my own journey that I would never, it's one thing to provide information if somebody asks you a question, but I would never tell someone you should or shouldn't do this, especially if you're in a position where, whether you're trans or you're having trouble conceiving naturally, or you're, looking to maybe have an abortion. I would never be the one to tell you you should or shouldn't do this, and I don't think the government has a role in doing that either. I am absolutely against all of the different bills that we've seen. I was against the overturning of Roe v. Wade. This is, as far as I'm concerned, this is not an issue. This is something that's being made an issue by people who are trying to divide us and control women's bodies and marginalize people's bodies.
Excellent. Okay, awesome. And then last topic for healthcare is your medical debt buyback and forgiveness program.
Yeah.
That was on your website. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah. So medical debt, just like any other debt in this country, if you're delinquent on it, ultimately that debt can be sold off to a debt collector. Say you owe $1,000. They'll buy it for half that, and then they'll ask you to pay the full amount, so they make $500, right? They might even call you up and say, hey, we'll make you a deal. If you pay us $600, we'll just wipe the whole debt. Things like that. Yeah. It is not impossible, and it's actually been done there's been several municipalities throughout the country that have done it, and most famously, John Oliver did it on Last Week Tonight. They bought up a bunch of medical debt for pennies on the dollar, and they forgave it. I would say that we should do the same thing. We should use some Idaho tax dollars to buy the medical debt for as many Idaho families as we can and forgive it. And there's already kind of a mechanism for this. So the governor has an emergency fund. Governor Little fought pretty hard to get that. I don't know that you necessarily need it, but if you're going to have it, I think the last thing it was used for was to help provide some support to ICE agents. I don't really think that classifies as an emergency. I do think crushing medical debt classifies as a statewide emergency, and I would be in favor of using that existing governor's emergency fund to buy medical debt and forgive it.
Excellent. Okay. Let's just briefly talk about the fact that we are in a heavily Christian state. Mm-hmm. Okay. And right now there's a word thrown around, or a phrase thrown around, called religious freedom. And I'm hearing a lot about religious freedom, and things come to mind like I saw a bill introduced for Bible reading in schools and putting the 10 Commandments on posters and classrooms and whatnot. And though this may not be a topic of concern for some, maybe some people aren't taking it seriously or whatnot, I know a lot of people are. How would you approach that?
I want to say, as someone who grew up Christian myself, and I don't consider myself one anymore, but I did grow up in that tradition, it is your prerogative to be whatever faith you choose to be in this country, Christian or otherwise. And it's certainly not all Christians. I would argue it's probably not even the majority of them that support these. It is a very vocal, very active minority of Christian supremacists. And they are effectively trying to take over our government and use it to boost their own priorities. There is a reason that we historically have had separation of church and state in this country. This is the reason. There's no point in sugarcoating it. This is Christian nationalism. I would veto any bill that is trying to, override that tradition of separation of church and state. And frankly, like many of these bills that they're proposing, like the Ten Commandments in school and those kinds of things, like those have been proven to be unconstitutional in multiple other states and cases across the country over decades. But they keep trying and they keep pushing for it and they're making progress. And, at some point it's like, do we actually value the rule of law, or do we just value what it says in one particular faith's book and their particular version of that doctrine, right? I'm absolutely against it. I think that if you're going to be pro-Christian in the United States, you need to be pro-freedom of religion and not try to dominate public space for the benefit of one private faith.
So, okay, eloquent. All right. Yeah, I agree with you. Also being raised Christian myself, I have no hatred of people who follow whatever faith they want. I think it's important we do have somebody at the top that accepts that there are different religions. And to me, religious freedom does mean the freedom of religion, not Christian freedom. It's religious freedom. So,
well, and I would even go so far as to say that, say these Christian nationalists get everything that they want, there's still going to be factions within the Christianity that they, advocate for. They'll just turn on each other. There's never going to be an end to this. You have to draw your line in the sand. We've already done that as a country, and we said separation of church and state and religious freedom. That's the line. Once you cross it, it's open season on everybody, Christian or otherwise.
Yeah, and this isn't a persecution of Christians in any way. This is just...
Nobody in this country is persecuting Christians.
Yeah.
That's not happening.
Yeah, awesome. All right. Well, let's go and move on to just a little bit about housing, okay? So there's a lot of renter abuse going on right now, and also the housing affordability crisis, which I don't even think about housing affordability because I'm probably not ever going to buy a house. So I focus more on rent, so I focus more on rent. Yep. Some rich person from California is more likely able to buy a house here than I ever will be, having grown up here.
Yep.
But I can rent for now. And it's something I'm constantly staying head above water to try and not only survive the process of moving and applying and being accepted and moving out and all the things that are involved with the renting process. But it's a problem. And you have some things on your site. Governor Little said that, it's inevitable. It's something we just have to deal with. It's a nationwide issue. But his $6.1 billion in tax cuts helped. And I'm not seeing that. I don't really know how that factors into anything that's helped us.
Now, property developers are seeing that. You and me are not.
Okay, but you mentioned statewide rent control tied to minimum wage and the national housing per diem rate. You mentioned multi-income social housing, and you mentioned tenants' right to counsel. Can you talk about those?
Yeah, so rent control first. I am basically suggesting that you tie a rent cap statewide, and maybe you have some micro adjusting to different regions of the state. Obviously rent prices are going to be different in Boise than they are in Twin Falls or one of the smaller towns, right? But having a rent control, a cap, and tying that cap, the ceiling of it, to the minimum wage, and I use the national per diem rates. If you're traveling, for example, and you pull up the government rate for your reimbursement for meals and lodging and those sorts of things, using those as a kind of a metric to decide where you would set that cap. But I think it's especially important to lean in on the minimum wage because we've also had that fight in this state. This was, almost 10 years ago now. We had the state legislature had a ban on municipalities raising their own minimum wages because it looked like McCall was going to successfully pass one, and there were a few other cities that were talking about it as well. I think if you were really interested in, the judo move against the landlord class, they're in it for their own self-interest. And so if they want to raise rates on their rentals, they're going to have to become advocates for raising the minimum wage. Because if you tie the cap to the minimum wage and you say no more than, say, 25% of your income can be spent on rent if you're making a minimum wage at full-time hours, well then, like I said, if the landlords want to raise your rent, they got to fight for a higher minimum wage so that you can afford it. So that's part of it. And there's other things that go into that too. Yeah. I don't mean to be, snippy about it, but that's part of it. You also mentioned the universal landlord's rights, tenants' rights. I think that in the same way that if you're accused of a crime, you have access to a public defender, you should have access to an attorney who specializes in tenants' rights disputes. So that if you have an issue with your landlord, you don't have to worry about not being able to fend for yourself, because that happens a lot too. It's not even just the rent. It's things like, safety issues on the property, or lack of maintenance and repairs, or, just abuse, right? These are things that even if you have a cut and dry case, and even in a state like Idaho where we have very few laws in favor of the tenant, even if you have a good case, if you can't afford an attorney, it doesn't matter. So making sure that you have access to one through effectively the same kind of system we'd have for a public defender. And then I'm sorry, I think I missed the middle part of the question.
The multi-income housing,
right.
social housing.
Yes. So we don't have a lot of public housing in Idaho. We do a little bit, but not a lot. I'm advocating for constructing new mixed income public housing. Mixed income because, and studies have shown this too. I've actually been to some conferences about this, but like it's not just, if you just have public housing and it's just the poor people living there, one, there's a social stigma attached to that, and so it makes it harder to advocate for these policies. But two, it's better for the communities, especially if you're building these new buildings in existing communities. If you allocate different levels, like, you have units available to tenants of different income levels, because it turns out it actually has a direct relationship on how people vote and how they engage with other people who aren't like them. If their neighbors down the hall are, like maybe they're from a higher wealth family and the neighbors down the hall are struggling to get by, they empathize. That's part of their community. Those are their neighbors. They're going to fight for them. And it's not something that happens if you're all separated. Like if all the wealthy people live in, walled off gated communities and all the poor people, live in the slums, it makes it very easy for people who have a vested interest in keeping those poor people and marginalized people off to the side. It makes it a lot easier for them to do that because, the rest of polite society isn't paying attention to them.
That's an anti-discrimination kind of thing that I think a lot of people don't really think about very often. I wasn't really thinking about that, but when I saw that, I'm like, yeah, it definitely makes sense, and we need more of that, especially in a place like Boise, Idaho, like where I live.
Yes.
I think that would be an easy place to get started, and we are on this dangerous trend, I think, of create with the wealth gap and everything, the class war, it helps repair those social mechanisms.
Absolutely. And there's also been a conversation in our state for a long time about public land use. I am very pro public land in Idaho. Obviously, we're a state with a great natural bounty, right? We've had a lot of instances where private developers have come in and gotten a sweetheart deal from the governor's office or the powers that be, whoever they may be at the time, and they're getting public lands for pennies on the dollar and using them for their own private benefit. I'm against that. I would support a moratorium on public land sale. But the other thing with that is, I think that we should start looking at reclaiming those public lands that have been lost, maybe identifying new land that's not being used and claiming that for public land use. And out of that, I think you can help solve some of the housing problem as well. If you're identifying land that like maybe it's not something where there's like a wildlife habitat or like a natural resource that we're trying to preserve, but just open land or things that we could maybe use for housing development. And so then that also answers another question that I've gotten a lot of, like, well, where and how would you build this public housing? Well, let's use some public land if it's appropriate to do so. I've worked in local government. You want to do well in local government, open a park, have a ribbon cutting at a park that you fought to build. You want to do right by the people who live in that community, build public housing there instead. And that's pretty much what I'm advocating for with this.
I do appreciate you mentioning the right to counsel, because when I saw that, I was like, I instantly had flashbacks of every single time I had to advocate for myself and the stress of not knowing and then just being in the office. I mean, it was just probably a year and a half ago, I was standing in a leasing office and I was crying. And I was crying to the people that were trying to charge me outrageous fees and not give me any paperwork that's legally binding, and everything was done by word of mouth. And it was just, I was having to fight for just my safety and my rights that I knew I had, but I didn't have any legal counsel there. And I thought, I can't imagine someone who isn't so versed in this renting experience, like an 18-year-old who just moved into their first apartment, just getting taken advantage of. I've just been in it for a while, so I know all the tricks, and I know how to protect myself because I've been burdened by it. So I think that legal counsel, really appreciate that.
If I can editorialize on that a little bit too, look, I understand that there are going to be a lot of people that are going to look at my campaign, and particularly if they've got, the credentials, right? The adults in the room probably think I'm being very silly. If you are on the fence about whether or not to support me and these policies, consider, I have been you. I have also been in a landlord's office crying because I have nothing left and they're taking what I don't have. I went through a medical bankruptcy several years back because I struggled with healthcare issues and I couldn't afford it and I was up against a wall, didn't have a choice. I have struggled through these exact same systems, and particularly with like the housing and the landlord issues. Like it's predatory, it's extreme graft. There are some good actors out there, but not enough, and certainly not enough to justify leaving the system as it exists now. And I can't forget the pain, and I can't forget the people that didn't make it and that ended up in much worse situations than I did. I was very lucky, like I was able to fight for myself, but I was also lucky. Most people aren't. I could never turn a blind eye to it. And at this point too, I mean, look, frankly, I've been endorsed by the only tenants union in the state of Idaho. It was Boise Tenants United. Now they've changed their name to Treasure Valley Tenants Union. They're probably going to have to change their name again because I know that they're advocating to become a statewide operation, and nice. I hope that they do. Their struggles are my struggles. My opponent, right, Terry Pickens is announced for the Democratic side. She's a lawyer who represents, real estate owners and landlords. We're not the same. I'm not out here to just try and throw shade at people, but I really need people, especially, people like you and me, to understand that, like, if there's someone fighting for the change that we need because we've experienced these problems, I am that person doing that.
Excellent. Okay. Let's go and move on to education here.
Yeah.
You said you want kind of K through 12 to be more college focused. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. And let me preface this too by saying, like, a lot of my public service career was in education, primarily universities, but also a little bit in like K through 12. I've been a paraprofessional, I've been a substitute, I've done a few different jobs, right? But like I used to do college advising at the university level. I've done like every administrative job in the university setting you can think of. I've probably done it. So when I say this, I'm not just saying, hey, we ought to do this. I'm saying, no, this is based on problems that I've seen in my day job or that people close to me have experienced. What I'm advocating for. So part of it is providing a universal like pre-K like daycare and just adding that on to our existing public school system. So like if you've got a child between the ages of say 2 and 5, and that's something that we can discuss when you're writing a bill what those ages actually end up being. But let's say 2 and 5. Someone who's daycare appropriate age but not old enough to start kindergarten or first grade yet. You can still take them to the public school. There's a separate daycare program for them there. And then it's good for 2 reasons. One, because it brings kids into the public school system a little bit earlier, so they're getting exposed to the teachers and the classmates they're probably going to have for most, if not all, of their public school career. And it's better learning outcomes for them. But the other thing is that it's good for working families. There are a lot of working families, young couples that are trying to make ends meet. Maybe you've got like the mom wants to go back to work and daycare is very expensive. So by the time she finds a daycare that even has openings, because there's not a lot of them out there, the cost is so ridiculous that it would pretty much eat up any income they'd make from her going back to work. And so then she throws up her hands and says, well, look, if I'm going to have to spend all the money on daycare anyway, I might as well stay home. It's not really an option. So it's good for working families, and then it provides a resource that is, there's just not enough of it, and what's there is too expensive. But it also helps working women specifically and gives them the opportunity to get back into the workforce if they so choose. So there's that component to it, and that's all part of the public education policy. The larger part of it, though, I want to restructure our existing K through 12 system because we actually have a handful of programs that already exist. So we've got like Idaho Launch, which provides money for Idaho high school graduates to go to Idaho universities. It's a set number, like dollar amount. I think it's $8,000 for a lifetime amount. And it's a list of majors that apply to it. I'm saying, why don't we just expand the dollar amount and cover all majors? There's things like Idaho Digital Learning Alliance or Digital Learning Academy, where these are online courses you can take as a public high school student or middle school student. There's dual credit options, right? There's several different things that already exist. Why don't we just streamline them and increase the curriculum a little bit? Because frankly, and I'm saying this as someone who did college advising, the first 2 years of college are pretty much your last 2 years of high school all over again. why do it twice, and especially do it twice and have to pay for it the second time? Why not just restructure it with the existing things that we have now, so that by the time you graduate high school, you go up to get your diploma, and you're also getting a 2-year associate's degree that you can apply to an Idaho college or university of your choice. And that's something that I'm saying from experience, like that's relatively easy to do. It's just logistics and tweaking the existing system. I'm not going to say it's going to be easy, but especially compared to some of the other things that I'm advocating for, that's one that I think you could largely do with a few strokes of a pen and some logistical meetings, rather than necessarily having to go through the issue of like a whole new piece of legislation.
Okay, and it really also helps people whose families might not be able to afford to send their kid to school,
Yes.
or kids who have trouble with scholarships programs and getting grants and whatnot.
Yeah.
It just gives them just that extra help. So, and it also increases the workforce and blah blah blah. So
Yeah. Well,
awesome.
and I don't want to spend too much on this, but I do want to clarify too that, like, look, I've worked in education long enough to know the system is not perfect. Part of the reason that a lot of people advocated for and wanted things like HB 93, and they wanted access to private charter schools, and they wanted options for homeschool, is because they had genuine issues with the existing public school system. And those issues are very real. I'm not suggesting that we ignore those things and force everyone back to public school. I'm saying we need to make our public schools better. This is one of the ways I think we do it without throwing the baby out with the bathwater, because frankly, a lot of those issues came from we don't fund our public education the way that we should. And we have a lot of structural issues that we're not paying enough attention to, and instead we're just kicking it out of the private sector like we always do, which isn't making the situation better. This improves outcomes for public school students, but it also is a strong incentive for people to, like, it's actually competitive now. Put your kids back in public school. And the way you need to do this, like, I was a smart kid. I was like a, type A personality, good grades. I'm going to go to college, right? Not every student is like that. Some students want to go and do trades. That's great. That would also be included in this. But there's also families where, even if they have like promising students who want to go on and do things, they may not have access because of monetary restrictions. They may not know that there are certain opportunities available. And so by streamlining all of this and making it a given that if you pass these classes, which are the base requirements for your high school diploma, you are getting that college education, it removes those barriers that already currently exist in the system. The only ones who do well, and like you can pretty much break it down by zip code and by income level, the ones that do well tend to be the ones who already had access to things like private tutors, or they have parents who have been to college. The ones who don't do well are kids from poor families, families that don't speak English as a first language, families in rural communities. So the current system, even with some things that we do very well, it's self-selecting. So the ones who already do well are going to continue to do well. The ones who already are doing poorly are going to continue to do poorly unless we level the playing field and remove systemic barriers. So yeah, I always try to clarify that, because there are people that say, well, we already do those things. It's like, yes, I know that AP classes and dual credit exist. That's not what I'm talking about.
Yeah, no, and I kind of get what you're saying too. Just I can still remember being in school and taking those college level courses and taking like English 101 and 102, but it was very kind of confusing. And then also it was like, they just felt like small little credits you're earning,
Yes.
but not this full on roadmap and this real, like this hand being held out to you. It didn't really feel like that.
Yeah.
So I really appreciate that. I love hearing that. So, and I'm glad that you mentioned the private school vouchers, and I think you pretty much answered kind of the questions I had about your stance on that. And I like that you kind of look at the broader picture of why those public school voucher system might have manifested itself. And I'm obviously not a fan of it, but I do support public education, and I think that's just the answer.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of people do believe that, honestly.
Yeah.
Because I think most of Idaho's kids are public schools, and it's also for the rural communities. Like rural communities, you're not going to necessarily be able to send your kid to a private school, and then just to be that voice in their own, I don't really want to pay for private school vouchers with my taxes.
Well, and you shouldn't. I think that that's an abomination of everything that public service is supposed to be about.
Yeah.
But I also, on the same token, don't think that, I think you'd be a fool to ignore the very real like rage and like hardship that a lot of conservative people in Idaho are feeling. And like when they lean towards supporting these policies, like they're not doing it because they're stupid. They're doing it because they're hurting. They're looking for an answer. They're not getting it. And this seems like at least a direction to go in. So whether it's public school or healthcare, I mean, name an issue. If you're looking at the genuine political divide in our electorate in this country, every time it seems to come down to like, well, are you desperate enough to panic? Are you afraid? Are you getting by or not? And if you're leaning towards the side of fear and doubt and struggling, I'm not saying I agree with it, but like the conservative argument does have a certain ring to it. And we can't ignore that if we're going to actually address the systemic issues that created this push.
One issue I want to touch on, and it's kind of it's kind of contentious, but we've been seeing a lot of gun violence in schools, and I think that a lot of conservatives and Democrats alike just recognize that kind of fear of sending your kid off to school. It's just we're different times, and we can see something on the news and just forget about it, and that's how commonplace it is now. And I think a lot of people are afraid to send their kids to schools, and I know a lot of people are afraid to talk about this, but it's a real issue. We also have a lot of teen suicides, things like that. So I think there's a lot of fear surrounded sending your kid to school nowadays.
Yeah.
So just being considerate of every parent right now that's afraid to send their kids to schools. Do you have any kind of stance on kind of what's been going on there and kind of what reassurances or anything you would give to parents being in that position?
Unfortunately, I don't have a lot in the way of reassurance. I can say that the people who work in public schools are just as afraid, if not more afraid, than the parents are, because, they do care about the students and they are doing what they can. But put yourself in the position of an educator who has to make the decision of like, how much am I willing to risk myself for my students? And even if the answer is the maximum, I will put my life on the line for them. You still have to consider that. And there's policy decisions that have to be made of like, codes, like at what situation is it appropriate to break from, hey, our normal protocol is, the alarm bell rings and we all get together and like make our way like, through the window if we have to, and like get out to the football field and then do a head count, to the point where it's like, nope, every man for himself. That is actually a policy decision that your local schools are having to make, to the point where it's like, hey, member of staff, teacher, paraprofessional, or otherwise, what's your personal defense weapon? Do you have one? You should think about getting one. A baseball bat, a taser, something that you keep somewhere in the event that we have one of those, like, hey, every man for himself, like your goal is to get to safety regardless. That's the fact that we're even at the point where we're having that conversation is insane. And obviously a big part of that is gun violence. And the other part of it too, and this is the part where we get into the nuance that's like especially hard to talk about.
Yeah.
Security theater. I think we've seen enough instances in this country now where, okay, every school has a school resource officer, and then there's a school shooting and the police show up and wait outside. How's that helping anyone? That's not protecting students. You're waiting until the violence has passed, and then you're doing the wrong kind of head count. You're doing a body count. Why are we spending this much money? Why are we amping up the fear around this, for a security apparatus around our public schools that is frankly at least as ineffective as TSA is? It's to make people feel better rather than actually addressing a problem. And then the worst part of it is not only is it a huge waste of taxpayer dollars for these security systems that aren't really solving the problem, but then because you now have cops in every school, things that could have been a minor disciplinary infraction at the school level, like maybe at worst case something's going on your permanent record, is now the beginning of a criminal record because a teacher or a principal didn't want to deal with a particular student. And then when you look at the numbers behind that, it almost invariably turns into who's the ones getting the criminal record? Students of color, students with developmental disabilities, or if they are on like some kind of an IEP, like students that are already struggling, who then struggle in the wrong way, and now they're dealing with a cop. So I don't have anything to say in terms of, kind words or things that might make people feel reassured, because the problem still exists and we're not really doing anything to address it. But more than that, I think that people should be more concerned about what we've done as a Band-Aid for this, in the forms of, like I said, like the security theater and, cops in every classroom. I mean, they're not only not productive to a solution for this problem, they're actively causing harm in a lot of instances. You're limited to what you can do at the state level. There are some things, and this is one too, where like when we talk about gun control, like full disclosure, like I'm a socialist. I'm not against the Second Amendment at all. I own a rifle. I think that especially in the last few years, with a lot of the violence that we've seen against marginalized communities, yeah, like I'm right out there with the people like, trans women and gay people and like people of color who are like buying guns for the first time. Like, honestly, I agree with them. I think they should. I think you should be arming yourself and thinking about what your plan would be, because we also have a serious problem in this country with violent extremism. And I'm not going to go so far as to say, well, the answer to a bad guy with a gun is a good guy with a gun. That's not true. But how do you balance the fact that we have a gun violence problem and we're not dealing with it? And we also have an extremism problem. And if you don't fight, you will die. There is no way I can answer this with one policy. I will say part of my platform includes, I'm calling it universal hunter's education. Basically, I'm just advocating for, if you're already required to take hunter's ed, the requirements wouldn't change. It's still optional if you wanted to do it voluntarily. We expand the existing hunter's education program to include like more detailed instruction on different firearms, more than it currently does. We also include things like first aid training, CPR training, mental health first aid training, and emergency response training, emergency management. And when I say that, I'm not talking about like, oh, I know how to manage an emergency. No, I mean like there's a logistical thing. And I know this from running a transit system, right? Emergency management is things like National Incident Management System, Incident Command. And what that means is if you're trained in that, you know now how to plug into the existing command structure whenever like fire, police, EMS show up on the scene, whether it's a natural disaster or an attack, or sometimes it's not even a bad thing, like just a large scale event that requires coordinated security. Well, now you know how to speak the language. You know how to plug in with the existing people whose job it is they're trained to do these things, and you can render aid. Hey, like you need people to go and man the soup kitchen. You need people to set up the field hospital. You need me to stand with my arms like this and cordon traffic. I know how to do that now. I've been trained, and I know how to plug into the existing system so that I'm not just a bunch of like random militia members showing up and getting in the way and making everything a lot more confusing. What I'm proposing, frankly, is not a complete answer to the existing crisis for gun violence. It's not, and I'm not going to pretend it is. I think it would help. I think it would help move the conversation into a more positive direction. But I also think that it empowers the people who are so adamant about having these guns because they're supposedly trying to do what's right for their community. I'm basically saying put up or shut up. You want to be out there, I'm the good guy with a gun? Great. You got a gun on one hip, you got your first aid kit on the other, and now you actually know how to use all of this stuff in accordance with existing protocol, the way the professionals do it, and stay the hell out of their way. I don't think it solves every problem. I think it's a start. And I think it at least starts to address some of the other concerns where I talked about, like, like I said, we've got an issue with violent extremism, right? Like, read between the lines. I'm not trying to take your guns away. I'm trying to make your militias better, and I'm trying to do it in a way that ideally helps solve part of the gun violence problem as well.
I was very curious how you'd answer that, because that is a very sensitive topic for a lot of people.
Extremely, yeah.
It's a very difficult conversation for, I think, anyone to talk about. But I do like that you mentioned not only like kind of like bystander training, where it's like, yeah, if you are a citizen that is armed, you have all the relevant training that makes you feel empowered. And also just the hunter's education, respect for the weapon and everything, just getting all that firsthand experience.
Yeah, and I'm not going to pretend like I've got the issue licked. I don't. No. This is not the end of the conversation. This is the beginning of it.
Yeah, and it's not up to one person ever, I don't think,
absolutely
to be able to figure out what's happening with our teen mental health and everything like that, but also recognizing when we do Band-Aids or we do performative actions to try and use that as an excuse to not talk about it anymore. So yeah, all very appreciated. Let's go ahead and continue on down here. There's just a lot of topics I want to cover here. So,
absolutely.
Tech. You talk about STEM investment in Idaho, and there are a couple things I want to talk about, so I'll just go over them. You can talk about any order. So it's STEM investment, but also the uprise of, this is going to sound crazy, which I can't even believe I'm saying this, but the uprise of AI and data centers.
Yep.
And I feel like AI is a big topic worth talking about, even though a lot of people hear it and think science fiction. I personally am worried about how that's going to come to Idaho, and the data centers that they're building, the resources they take, and the problem, essentially, I consider a problem building these data centers in Idaho. And then our concerns around surveillance and privacy in Idaho. I think a lot of Idahoans do care about surveillance and privacy. So these are three big topics I want to talk about in the world of tech.
Okay, so starting with the industry part, we've talked about my education policy. obviously, if I'm creating a lot of well-educated Idaho graduates, we need to come up with jobs for them. We already do have somewhat of a tech sector in Idaho, like Micron, for example, is based here in Boise. We need more of those if we're going to attract and maintain the people that we're educating in this state. Otherwise, like best case scenario, we've got a lot of really bright, well-educated Idaho residents that then have to go to other states in order to find jobs that are in their fields. So we need to do a lot of large-scale public investment in creating new like tech enterprises, productive ones. Like I'm going to be honest, I think a lot of the hype around AI is a scam. I'm not talking about building data centers. I would like to see more companies like Micron that produce usable goods like semiconductors, things that we use in all of our technology and that there's a global shortage of. It has been for a long time now. New software, right? But I'd also like to do it in a way that, look, if you're going to buy into this idea that public investment leads to innovation, you have to lead it with a way that allows people to take the initiative with that innovation. If you're just leaving it up to the hands of corporations, they might innovate something, but then they own all of that. I would like to also include some small business grants specifically for the tech sector so that, let's say you get a company like Micron or a new one that comes in, sets up shop. They're going to attract a lot of talent, and that's going to be a lot of people with a lot of intelligence and ability that are going to be talking around the water cooler. They're going to be having drinks after work. They're going to come up with ideas. And now we're empowering them using some state dollars. Go and test out your idea. Start your own little company. Start it in Idaho. Grow it in Idaho. Hire Idaho-based, engineers and scientists, and build that industry here, right? That's good for us, but it's also good for the country. It's good for the world. Like I am far from a Luddite. I'm a Star Trek nerd. I want to live in the sci-fi world of tomorrow. I want it to start here. So that's part of the conversation. But I've mentioned Micron a few times now, and getting into the AI topic. This is recent news. Micron's announced that they're not doing any more consumer DRAM chips. They're not going to produce any more of that for the consumer market because they're more focused on producing products for data centers and artificial intelligence. So they are abandoning the consumer industry basically so that they can buy into whatever this crazy AI Ponzi scheme is. And they're probably going to make a lot of money. Like, I'm not saying it's a bad investment for them. It actually makes a lot of sense. But it also means that all of the products that regular people use, their cell phones, obviously, but like their cars, their smart fridge, every device has some little piece of electronics in it now. That's just the world we live in. Now, we can argue about whether or not we should. I have a whole side tangent about a coffee pot I'm still very upset about that had some microchips in it that did not need to be there. Okay. But my point is, we're not getting away from that world anytime soon. And all of these consumer products that we all have to buy are going to continue to rise in price because now we're not even, like Micron and companies like it are just abandoning that side of the industry just to pump all of their science and tech and engineering into data centers for AI. It's almost like those with money and resources are cutting off everyone else from the economy and trying to build a little bubble for themselves. Like they really think AI is going to pay off to the point where you don't need human labor anymore, and we're all going to have personal robots. And if you're not rich enough to buy into that, that's okay. You can just go live in squalor. The movie Elysium comes to mind. That seems to be what they want, instead of it being a cautionary tale. So I think since we're talking about AI and data centers, and Idaho, I've seen some speculation that Idaho is probably going to be another state that is going to be targeted for some of this because we have loose regulation. And because land is cheap and we have, relative good control over our power supply, right? Like you and I as consumers don't benefit, but if a company wants to come in and boost production for their electrical grid, yeah, like Idaho Power is probably going to be there to help them out, right? Like we are a prime target, just like a lot of other places have been, for these data centers to come in, destroy our local economies, and basically destroy our public lands as well. If we don't actively fight against that, and you do it two ways, one by, like I said, attracting and building actual tech industry that really produces like usable things for humans, not just we're going to replace people with robots, but also strong regulation and fighting against these things. Because again, this is a scam. At some point, it's three big companies right now that are basically just handing the same $500 million or $500 billion between them. The bubble will burst. How much of the real technology will be left? That's anyone's guess. But the bubble's going to burst. We're all going to take a hit. And the only places that are going to stand a chance of at least maintaining, let alone coming out on top, are going to be the ones that had strong regulations and strong public investment to take care of regular people and build actual industry. Everything else is going to get lost in the fire.
Okay, excellent. Well, that is good to know that you're paying attention, first of all, and you're kind of informed on the topic, and you have a stance on it, and you understand kind of some of the worries I have about those big companies coming to Idaho and trying to just buy up our resources and take up our spaces. And
I mean, like I know we've got a lot of questions, but if I can get a little more specific with this too, right? Like I'm a tech nerd. Like my home computer, I use a Framework laptop that I run Linux Mint on. Like I said, I'm not a Luddite. I am a geek. Framework, I like them a lot. Not a sponsor, but like I own their product, one of their products, and like the whole idea is we've made a laptop. We've engineered it to be completely open source, so all the schematics are available. If you had the ability, you could make your own parts for it, and people do. And it's meant to reduce e-waste. And it also ties in with right to repair, which is something that we're working on to add to the platform as well. But like I own it. I own the software that's on it. If I want to fix it or modify it or do whatever I want with it, I can. I think that's the kind of tech world we should be advocating for, whether you're talking about AI or semiconductors or whatever. But part of the platform that I've got talking about investment in new like tech businesses, I mean, Framework, their manufacturing is in Taiwan. Why isn't it in Idaho? And I think we should be thinking about that. What other companies are out there doing things that we actually want to support? And how can we create incentives for them to come and set up shop here and actually like change the world?
Excellent. Okay. Well, I mean, your computer probably looks pretty nice. Maybe a little different than maybe the one Brad's got at home.
It's got stickers on it.
That's pretty cool.
Yeah.
All right. Well, yeah, we'll just keep moving on. Agriculture, just a couple of questions about that. You said state grant funding for ag, including small and independent farms, first-time farmers, and people who are looking to redevelop their farms. Can you tell us about your connection to the ag industry and kind of those grants?
Yeah, I'm a farm kid. I grew up on a small farm. We raised cattle. We had chickens, ducks, the whole 9 yards. Alfalfa was our main thing. So I grew up, bucking hay bales and moving pipe and picking rock, just like everyone else in my town. And look, you have to understand the ideal of what we have as Americans, and particularly Idahoans, when we talk about things like small family farms, largely doesn't exist anymore. And I think that's a tragedy because it didn't need to be that way. The average American farmer is over the age of 60. We have about a third of the farmland that we had in this country in the 1970s. Some of that is because of automation and improved technology and more production per acre. That's natural. But most of it is because of private development and land being treated as a speculative asset rather than, something that we should treasure and something that provides useful productivity for human beings. The largest owner of farmland in the United States is Bill Gates. I think that says a lot about our current landscape. So my family farm, right? My grandpa actually just passed away back in January, and as a family, we're kind of discussing, well, what do we do now? Do we try and get the farm back into production? Grandpa wasn't really able to do much with it the last few years of his life, so there's a lot of decay. It's probably going to cost us some money to do that. Do we sell it? If we do sell it, is it going to stay a farm or is it going to become a development? And do we want that, right? Because we do care about it. We're attached to this land, right? Like we all grew up on it. And the best thing I can say about my situation is that, at least with us, we're very fortunate in that the land's paid off. But a lot of people in our situation, it's not. There's a lot of farm debt, or maybe they still have a mortgage on the land. So you factor all of these things I've just said together, and you've got a prime situation where these supposedly, the idyllic small family farm, they're aging out. They're either looking to retire and get out of farming, or they can't farm anymore and don't have a choice. And even if they want to keep it in the family or pass the farm on to someone else who would continue to farm it, they probably don't have that option either, because there's debt, and because even if there's no debt, it's a risk business. There's a lot of money that goes into investing in a farm to make it productive. And even if you've got, say, 18, 19-year-old farm kid who grew up doing everything I grew up doing, and they want to take over the family business, they might not be able to, even if they want to, let alone someone who's coming at it, who's never done it before, but would like to try their hand at it. So how do you fix it? I think the first thing is admitting that there's a major problem with it and that there's some systemic reasons for that. There's a lot of money on the table from federal grants already that a lot of small farmers just don't take advantage of, either because they don't know where to ask, they don't know how to file the paperwork, or frankly, they're not super trustful of the government, and I empathize with that. I've been a public servant for 12 years, and I'm a big advocate for public investment in infrastructure, but I'm the first one to tell you when there's a problem, and there's a lot of problems in this industry too. So fixing some of those loopholes. But I mean, you have things like farmer wants to modernize. They build a large greenhouse. Great. It's like $35,000 or more of investment, depending on the size of the greenhouse. Probably a lot more. Did they know that they could get almost all of it paid for by a federal grant and they wouldn't have had to change anything? You just fill out a paper and do a report at the end? No. Right? So making sure that they have better access to the stuff that's there. But then the big thing, and this is where I hope it is transformative, creating state-level grants and an actual program where, hey, are you somebody who's trying to get into small farming for the first time and you need money for land? Here's a grant that will do that. And grants are different than loans. Grants are, we're giving you the money for this stated purpose, and you don't typically pay that back. Some grants you do, but typically you don't. But also creating a program where, say you're an older farmer and you're looking to get out of the business, you want to sell your land, but you want to keep it as a farm and you're struggling with that, the state will come in and buy your farm at market value, and we will match it with a young up-and-coming farmer who will then have a chance to sort of buy that land off of the state government, so pay that back so that it's something we can continually reinvest in, and then they can try their hand at farming the way that those old school farmers did. So that way you're maintaining what we have, and then if you're really proactive, you can start reclaiming some of this land back for small-scale agriculture. And it's not going to be easy. It's also going to require things like modernization. Like maybe we're starting to look at things like permaculture. Maybe we're starting to look at things like aquaponics, where you've got systems where you're producing like fish and shrimp and stuff, and that's helping to fertilize like green crops, right? There's a lot of different ways you can do this, and it's probably going to require a lot of those different techniques if you're going to not only reinvest in small agriculture, but to make it viable and make it something that can actually compete against this very entrenched system that we have of factory farms on the one side and private equity dominating the landscape and buying up all of this farmland, effectively just to hoard it so that the line on the stock market can continue to go up. You have to do all of those things if you're going to start to dismantle the extreme set of circumstances we have that are working against agriculture in this state.
Okay, well, I'm not an expert on agriculture and I don't know much about it and I'm not really close to it. So I'll admit that, but maybe that's part of the problem. But yeah. I really appreciate it. Sounds like you have wisdom on the topic, you have experience on the topic, and that you do care. And you had it right there on your website. You want to help create that state grant funding. And to me, that all sounds, very, it just makes sense. Again, another common sense policy to me, to support family farms. I mean, and what I do know about farming is that when I drive through Idaho, I see a lot of farmland. And not only are we famous for our potatoes, but I've known a lot of farmers or people in the farming communities, especially in rural areas and whatnot, and I understand the importance of agriculture. It just seems like something you don't really have to look that far into to understand its importance. And, I can just imagine being a family farmer and wanting to pass down what I spent my whole life building to my son, and my son not being able to take that over even though they want to. It just, there's going to be heartbreaking stories of this happening from the evil big private, Yeah. So, I mean, it definitely sounds like something that those in the industry ought to pay attention to and maybe ask you some more questions themselves.
Yeah, well, I mean, you said common sense, and like I do think a lot of it is stuff that like the average person can get their head around, that there's a problem and something needs to be done. I think a lot of people get lost because like it's not that these solutions are complicated, but they are complex, and they're things that they don't necessarily come to you intuitively, like learning how farm policy works, or like how government budgets and management for contracts work. Like anyone can learn it, but it takes time and it takes a certain level of confidence to even try. And so a lot of people kind of just get pushed to the wayside, and they see like, hey, there's this problem, someone ought to do something, not realizing that like, hey, with like just a little bit of knowledge, you can do a lot. And so that's a lot of the reason why I'm campaigning, is because, I grew up with very little. I've been through most of the problems that you can experience as an Idahoan, and I've had the benefit of a long and fruitful public service career where like I do know the system really well, and I want to leverage that experience and knowledge back for the people who shaped me.
Perfect. All right. So kind of just give it back to your roots. Cool.
Yeah.
And I do say common sense. I know that some people have hijacked that terminology in the world of politics.
They
But
have, yeah.
yeah. Okay.
Not to call you out. No,
No,
like
no, no.
I do
Yeah.
too, you know.
Yeah. Okay. All right. So, and then let's go ahead and talk about briefly about the climate. Okay. So you had talked a little bit about public lands before, which I think you already answered my questions there.
Sure.
You care about, Idaho is a state known for its public lands, and I think we have the most public lands.
We're definitely up there if we're not
like,
number one. Yeah.
Yeah, we might not be number one. I was like, but like 60% or something. But we had our public lands rally because of the One Big Beautiful bill that was like threatening selling off our public lands.
Yep.
But you've mentioned that, and I do want to talk a little bit about I know a really passionate group of individuals that really care about clean energy, and companies like Idaho Power greenwashing, making commitments for clean energy. And you mentioned on your website a little bit about getting off grid with our power, and then we have organizations like the Sierra Club advocating for community solar, like community solar programs, things like that. And we also have our utility costs. Just recently, going before the PUC, they're trying to raise our power bill, things like that. So the cost of utilities are going up in a time when we can't afford it. So just those topics specifically, like just our utility situation that's going on right now and our power sources.
Yeah. The first thing you have to understand about the electrical system in the United States is we don't have an electrical grid, we have a cartel. And I don't say that flippantly, like that's what it is, right? The only way you can break from that is by taking away their product. So if you encourage, especially in a state like Idaho, where we have a great abundance of natural, like renewable energy sources, right? Like wind, solar, hydroelectric, geothermal is what I meant to say. But all of those things. Does it not make sense to utilize those to the maximal amount? And I know that we've had the whole thing about like the Lava Ridge development, and like I have problems with that too. Chiefly being, I don't think we should give public lands over to a bunch of private developers in a sweetheart deal, and then they're the only ones that benefit. I don't care if we have a generation of electricity and we overproduce and it sells to California. That's money in our pocket, unless we don't own it, right? Like if it's just benefiting a handful of private developers, that's a huge problem, especially if they're using public lands to do it. So that's a separate issue, but my point is, if you want to do this in a way that fixes the problem with the system, helps address climate change, and maybe most importantly, puts power back into the hands of individual people and communities, microgeneration is the way to go. So more incentives, grants, and as much as we can come up with. I know that like obviously we have a budget issue, but creating incentives so that people can get access to, like if you own a home, or if you have permission, or if you have a place where you can set up like a solar panel or a windmill, or in the rare case where you actually can like set up a geothermal rig in your house, I think we should incentivize that as much as possible, because one, it's good for the economy, right? If everyone is producing their own electricity, they're selling it back to the grid at some amount, it's money in their pockets, it's money circulating in the system. Two, it's good for the environment. It's less dependence on fossil fuels, especially if we can create enough energy from this and our existing power infrastructure that we're producing green energy that can be then sold to other states. That then lowers their need to use fossil fuels. So like the more you can put into the system, the less you have to rely on dirty energy. But then there's also, not that I'm hugely worried about this, but there's a security and resiliency issue. If you have a problem with the power grid and it goes down, whether because you have a storm, which happens in Idaho all the time, we get bad weather and the power goes down, or in the unlikely but possible chance of some kind of a terrorist attack or something, because that's something too, if you follow anything with like national security policy, we know that our power grid in this country is vulnerable. It's a lot harder to attack something when it's dispersed amongst the population. There's a lot of benefits to this, and it's hard to like even go into all of them, because it just makes sense for a lot of different issues that if you have the ability to generate electricity on your own, just do that, right? Like it's kind of a no-brainer. But the reason we don't do it is because, like I said, we don't really just have a power grid in this country, we have a cartel. It is not in the best interest of electrical utilities to advocate for microgeneration. It's just not. I don't care if we lived in a world where solar panels were somehow free and you could pick them up at the gas station. Like, they will not let you do it. They will lobby against it. They will change the rates so that it's no longer economical. Like, you have people that bought in and invested and put a solar panel on their house, and they're tens of thousands of dollars in debt But they did it with the understanding that it would ultimately pay for itself in the long run through savings and through selling the surplus back to the grid. And now, because it changes to those rates, it is no longer economically viable anymore. The circumstances that they bought into no longer exist. Why did we allow that to happen, right? And the truth is, it's because people aren't able to fight for this issue with the same capacity that a bunch of lawyers working for a lobbying firm that benefits, the energy industry are able to fight. That's really all it comes down to. The only way to deal with that is strong government intervention and regulation. And frankly, I would go so far as to saying nationalizing the power grid. I don't think that private energy companies should exist. It's a public utility. I think that it should just be owned by the government. That's not something I can necessarily do as governor, but I can advocate for microgeneration, and that's why it's in my platform.
Okay, excellent. Thanks for talking on that. All right, so you had mentioned the public transit trust fund, and I did kind of want to just dive a little bit deeper on that because the public transit trust fund sounds like a pretty interesting idea for anybody who, let's say, can't buy a car right now, which is a lot of people, I would say, or people that are experiencing too many car troubles or for insurance for vehicles. So can you talk a little bit about your public transit trust fund plan?
So the first thing to understand with this, Idaho is one of 2 states in the country, it's us and I believe West Virginia, that do not provide any money for public transit from the state budget, but they also don't allow transit agencies to go out to the voter and have a ballot initiative or put it on the ballot in some other way to basically say, hey, we'll have some kind of property tax or a levy, and we'll use that funds to provide transportation services in this geographic area. Every other state does one or the other or both. Idaho and like I said, I think West Virginia is the other state where we don't allow that. So you're really operating from a disadvantage. But then on top of that, Idaho is what's called a Dillon state. So they follow the Dillon rule, which effectively just means the way we set it up, your local sales tax dollars. So I'm talking to you in Boise. If I go down to the grocery store and buy a soda, there's going to be a 6% sales tax on that soda. That does not go to the city of Boise. It goes back to the state, and the state then apportions it out based on their priorities. That really, especially when you're talking about public transportation, there's a whole host of other things. Like if your municipalities aren't able to claim some of that sales tax revenue, they're at a disadvantage. Their budgets take a hit, and Idaho's city budgets are all really struggling. But when you're talking about something like public transit, which is frankly the redheaded stepchild in government policy, and I say that with love, we are, right? As an industry. You are not only kneecapped in your ability to raise funds through traditional means, but now the only way you can get any local money has also been cut. And public transit funding in this country is mostly federal dollars. So you get these federal grants. In a situation like Boise, it's typically close to a 65-35 split. So 65% of the funds come from the feds. You're required to put up the other 35% as a municipality or as whoever's getting the grant. In our case, when I worked for the city of Twin Falls, the program was about $1.5 million a year. The city would have to come up with 35% of that. That's a pretty big chunk of change in a relatively small municipal budget when, like I said, you don't have any of these means of generating revenue that other states can have. I should also mention, as a quick aside, the only places in Idaho that do have local option sales tax are the resort communities. So Ketchum and Sun Valley and those kind of places. Find that very interesting. I have thoughts, but the rest of your cities and towns can't benefit from that. So what I'm proposing, I'd like to just put more money into the state budget, but that would be separate. I would like to create a public transit trust fund. So every time you go to pay for your car registration, every year, every 2 years, you pay a nominal fee. I'm saying somewhere between $5 and $15. I think I put 10 in the platform, but that number, we can negotiate on that. That money is pooled into a publicly managed trust. It accrues interest over time until it vests, and then once it hits a certain threshold where there's a significant amount of money in the system and the interest coming in every year is enough, you then use that to reinvest into public transportation operations and infrastructure, which can then be used as part of that match requirement I was talking about for federal funds. So it not only helps address the problem, which is we need more public transportation in Idaho, even in rural communities, by the way. It is not just a city thing at all. Most transit is highly beneficial for rural areas too. So it helps alleviate that problem. But by providing these funds for transit, which typically gets ignored, now these local cities and towns that had already been providing money for transit can either continue to put that money in and bolster their systems even more, or they can choose to reallocate those funds to other local priorities. So there's a whole series of knock-on effects for this. And I'll leave this too with saying, for every dollar you spend on public transportation, you get $5 in economic impact. That's things like people going to the grocery store and spending money. Preventive healthcare, they see a doctor once and they don't have to see them 5 times because they caught an issue early and didn't get sick. Education benefits, if somebody can take the bus to go to classes and get their degree, and then they stay in the community and get a good paying job, like that's tax revenue. For every dollar you spend, it's $5 in economic impact. We're leaving money on the table. And this is something that people don't understand. Whether I'm talking about public transit or healthcare or education, public investment, your tax dollars being put to work for social programs, creates economic impact. It creates revenue. It makes the market better for capitalists, for business. So it's kind of a no-brainer. But unfortunately, we are in a situation in Idaho where, and it's the same legislatures every time, like the Venn diagram of people who are against public transportation because it's communist or it's going to make us like California. They have the same attitude about healthcare, education, and everything else. That Venn diagram is a circle, right? And it's, unfortunately, in Idaho, it's also bipartisan. When I was running the transit system in Twin Falls, I went to a conference. I spoke to a Democratic member of our legislature who gave me about 10 minutes of lip service talking about how great it was that we were fighting for transit in Twin Falls and that he was going to fight for us and we were going to change things and make it better. I don't think he was paying attention. As he was walking out of the conference room, he threw my business card away. I don't think he realized I saw that. So that's the environment we're in. It's incredibly hostile to public investment, but especially public transportation. And so then when people say, well, you can't pay for any of these things, it's a pipe dream, I'd argue, no, actually, it's a matter of finding revenue sources. And we can do that, and we need to be having that conversation. And that's where this public transit trust fund comes in.
Yeah, I mean, I can think of like a million reasons why public transit needs to be improved, at least in the city I spend most of my time in, which is Boise. I mean, I think of DUIs on the rise. I think of the gas prices. I think of just getting in a traffic jam every time I go anywhere. And I just think about when I do try and take that public transit system, they could probably use a little help. I mean, the buses are usually empty. They're hardly ever on time. I don't want to insult the bus system here, but like they just need some help, I think.
It's
Treasure
true.
Valley Ride. And so I fully support public transit. I think it makes a lot of sense, especially for down here, those of us down here at the bottom who just can't afford to be taking a vehicle everywhere and maybe just don't want to. And people who are afraid of driving. I mean, that's a real group of people.
Well, and so many of these things too, like transit, healthcare, education, like so many of these things are problems of growth. Idaho is growing. It's growing very quickly. That's not going to go away. And look, you can either sit by and let it happen and do nothing, in which case the only people who are going to benefit from it are property developers because they're going to make a lot of money from buying and selling the land. They're going to make a lot of money from building, parking lots and McDonald's and shopping malls on it, right? And then charging rents, right? So they're going to make a lot of money off of that. Or you can get ahead of it with public investment and infrastructure. And so then that growth doesn't just benefit business interests, it benefits the people who live here. And whether they lived here their whole lives or they just moved here. Because I'm also not about this whole go back to California or like whatever state you're from nonsense. Like Idaho's for everybody. And if you want to come here and be a part of Idaho, you should have the ability to do so. And if we're going to live by that, that means you have to tackle issues of growth and affordability. You have to tackle things like public transit funding. You have to tackle things like affordable housing, jobs, minimum wage standards. Like these are things that it turns out this isn't an issue of left versus right. Like it's just when you get enough people together, you actually have to start planning how an economy works. And we have a state legislature and a governor that are just actively disinterested in doing that unless somebody they know can make money off of it.
Absolutely. We do have a lot of topics, and I think in any other time in the world right now, we wouldn't have so many things to talk about. So I just appreciate you taking this time and kind of highlighting all these different groups that I've been spending my time with that just want to get these questions asked. So again,
absolutely
appreciate it. Let's move on to immigration because that is probably the biggest thing right now. In fact, on my phone right now, it's blowing up because we have ICE right now operating out of Meridian and Nampa currently driving around, pulling people off the streets, currently family members of people I know. And when I hear our president talking about things like birthright citizenship going before the Supreme Court, and I hear the term naturalized citizens constantly thrown around in a negative way, as a naturalized citizen myself,
Yeah.
I see choirs coming out advocating for due process because due process is just being ignored. We have an immigration problem at the border. A lot of people have acknowledged that, but we also have an immediate situation of people just being taken off the streets. It's hard for me to talk about with masks. They're violent. They're breaking windows. We have the situation in Wilder, possibly activity in Marsing, outside of Meridian and Nampa, and it's curious it's not happening so much in Boise, but we do have maybe $1 million expansion of the facility that's in Boise, but for some reason they're operating outside of Boise, which I always found interesting. We've been having community ICE trainings. We have people passing out zines with whistles and Know Your Rights cards.
Yep.
Can you tell us your stance on everything that's happening there? How people who are impacted by this, which is a lot of people, can look to your governorship and your campaign and say that this person is on my side?
So I don't want to be pithy about it because there's a lot of pain and there are a lot of people being seriously hurt right now. I will say that 2017 and 2018, I was at anti-ICE protests and rallies, and at the time the family separation at the border issue was a main topic, and I was at those protests with groups like Poder of Idaho and like the DSA chapters that were existing at the time. This has never not been an issue for me. I find it very interesting that it's almost like we stopped talking about it for a few years when Biden was president, and now it's like it's hitting us again. Obviously, it's worse now, but it never stopped being an issue from 2017, 2018, when we were all first getting upset about this. Like, it has remained a very serious problem. I also think it's interesting that we've gone from saying abolish ICE, which is still my perspective. I don't think ICE should exist as an organization. To now we're saying, and like I support the initiative of rule of law, and we should make sure that ICE is operating with accountability and not covering their faces, and those all make sense. But the core issue is that ICE shouldn't exist, and that what we're doing here is wrong. And you can focus on procedural issues like face masks and rule of law and reading your Miranda rights, or you can focus on the bigger issue that what we're doing here is effectively we have created a new Gestapo, and that's what this is. So I can't get rid of ICE as governor, but what I can do is say no state level cooperation with ICE or any federal law enforcement that's operating in assistance with ICE, period. And that could be a day one, state level executive order. For that matter too, any kind of investigations that things like ISP are doing, because there's been a lot of instances, like I saw in Nampa, people are calling the police for things that are not immigration issues. And the police sees that, somebody's brown, and so then they call ICE. And now whether that person was a citizen or not, now they're getting harassed by ICE. I also don't think you can ignore the very real white supremacist dog whistles that have been baked in with a lot of what's going on with ICE and our federal government. I mean, when the Department of Homeland Security is tweeting, the painting from the 1800s, and it's everyone going west with an angel guiding them, manifest destiny stuff. Yeah. We can't ignore that. Yeah. That is a problem. Frankly, this is some Nazi stuff, and we need to take that seriously. I'm obviously against ICE. I'm against cooperating with them in any way. I also think, so I spoke in April. I was asked to speak at the first, at the Hands Off rally in Twin Falls. And I talked about this. And I said, you need to know your neighbors. You need to know, how to take care of people, like first aid. You need to know where you can find clean food and water. You need to know self-defense, because there is going to be a moment, and it's already happening. We're watching it happen in our communities where people are being taken off the street. They're being beaten. They're being harassed. People who are citizens or not citizens, but frankly, it doesn't matter. Nobody should be treated like this. And even non-citizens have the same rights in this country. They have all of the same rights in terms of right to a fair trial and all the procedural stuff that we've talked about. but you're going to see it happen in front of you. And you're going to need to know who you are in that moment, because every one of us is going to have to make a choice. And I can't make it for you. And I can't necessarily tell you what's going to be right or wrong. But that moment's going to come. And when it does, you're going to have to figure out whose side you're on.
Well, I know people right now that are asking if people can donate gas money so they can do patrols to just follow ICE around and make sure they're monitoring their whereabouts to protect just communities and from the terror of it and all. And while this all is happening, I know that our current governor is, toting Operation No Return and wearing a cowboy hat. And, the president's making music videos with Sabrina Carpenter music about deporting these people. And you're right. I think there's something else happening behind the scenes that is not given enough attention, and people are afraid to talk about it. So I feel like your heart is definitely in the right place in terms of caring about our community members without the discrimination, without the racism, and all these things are being fueled.
I also think it's really important to understand that, it especially bothers me in Idaho because we've always had this tradition of being there for each other and for other people. I mean, we have a refugee center in Twin Falls, one that I've worked with in the past. And I'm very proud, as someone who grew up in the Magic Valley, that we have that there. And the community there, regardless of what you might see from certain conservative elements online, the community there is very much in support of that operation. We welcome them, and we have for a long time. And when we talk about these things, it's like, it disturbs me because not only are we going, in my opinion, so far in the wrong direction, but we're going in that direction from a place that I felt was so far in the right direction. And we're not just selling out people who are trying to make a life here. We are selling out our souls to this. And there's no coming back from that without violence. And I'm very concerned about where this is going to go. So things like, community watch, like you were talking about, like gas money and people patrolling their own neighborhoods. I'm very much in favor of that because we're at the point where that is, I hope that's enough. I really do. And I think that if we're not at least trying for those things, taking care of each other and watching each other's backs, then there's no hope.
We need more people in powerful places that are advocating for those of us down here who are taking risks every day. So I just definitely appreciate it. I could talk to you about immigration probably for a lot longer.
Oh, yeah.
We'll go ahead and move along. But I think I get the picture, and I just appreciate your stance on that. Just a brief discussion on Secretary of the Arts. What do you mean you want to have a Secretary of the Arts?
Yeah. So I actually, I got this idea from the CEO of Dropout. He had this idea for federal level Secretary of the Arts. And I think that it's a good idea for the state of Idaho as well. I'm basically saying a cabinet level position who would oversee the development and investment into arts and entertainment, both for educational purposes, but also for economic incentive. Idaho has places like Sun Valley where we have movie stars that come and have separate homes there. Like there's filming that takes place there, right? Like we have beautiful landscapes. We have all of these things that we have an active plein air painting community in the Moscow area, right? We have an abundance of opportunities for creative people to exist here and create valuable pieces of art and culture. And so just as much as I'm for science, technology, engineering, math, right? And I'm a huge advocate for those things. Full disclosure, right? I was in the first class of Idaho Science and Aerospace Scholars back in 2011. Big advocate for that program. We need to have a program like that for the arts and entertainment industry too. If you're somebody, I ended up going to journalism school instead of going to, become a scientist or an engineer. But if you want to be a writer or a painter or an animator, right? I have a huge soft spot for animation. These are things, as important as it is to invest in engineering and math and technology, things that change our material conditions, it's just as important to invest in things that move our souls, that move our feelings, that make human life more interesting and livable, right? That expand our understandings of ourselves. And you can't do that if you don't take it seriously, both as an economic instrument and as something of cultural value. So creating a Secretary of the Arts position and putting some funding under that secretary so that they can do things like grants for people who want to do artists in residencies, right? Or if they want to do like community art projects, like if they want to do like a big like mural or something in their local community. There's a whole swath of things that you could do under this, and we're not doing any of it. So I think even just a little bit would be a huge step in the right direction, but also understanding that, like, just from the economic perspective alone, the entertainment industry in this country is a massive generator of wealth and tax dollars and jobs. And I feel like just in the same way where we talk about things like, we have a tech sector in Idaho, or we have like all of this natural energy generation potential, right? Or natural resources. Like, we have a lot of abundance, a lot of things that we can use to benefit our economy and growth and like the people who live here. The potential for developing arts and entertainment here is massive, and we're just not even touching it. So this would, I think, take that seriously and focus on some things that, I don't think that we should do like the science, technology, math, education, and not also focus on these other things as well, because you need to have a good foundation in humanities if any of the stuff you're doing in science and technology is going to have any meaning, right? Like, we're so focused on like, yeah, we're going to have AI and replace humanity. And I'm saying, no. We should be investing in what makes humanity special and unique in a cosmos that is very cold and difficult.
Yeah, I mean, excellent. I think Idaho, that encapsulates kind of what Idaho has always meant to me in comparison to the rest of the country, is that it's actually been very close to the arts and very proud of its arts. And we spend a lot of time when we're not outdoors, appreciating the arts here. I mean, there's not a lot to do outside of Idaho and doing, getting connected to, it moves a slower pace here, I would say. Idaho moves at a slower pace, and we have more time to stop and smell the roses. And like you said, I think it is really important we don't leave the arts behind while we pursue technology.
Yeah,
for all those reasons.
As much as I said, I'd like to see like the next Micron or Framework company be an Idaho-based company. I'd like to see the next, Stephen King or George Lucas be an Idaho resident.
Let's talk about just women. So women right now, I feel like, are kind of feeling a little bit of under attack. There are women who have come to me talking about that they are survivors of assault, and they feel like, it's something that's not talked about very often. It's talked about a little more recently on the national scale, but just creating a safe state for women. And this also includes we talked about the OBGYN crisis that is going on. We talked about the reproductive freedom that's going on, bodily autonomy. This is also the highest state of female incarceration.
Mm-hmm.
So kind of why would women in Idaho take interest in your campaign?
Well, from the healthcare perspective first, and we talked about it a little bit already, but my Medicare for All policy would include female reproductive healthcare and abortion access. And for trans women, trans healthcare would be covered under that as well. So that's one thing. But I also see that is largely restorative. That is giving rights back that have been taken away or have been under attack. In terms of things like incarceration rates, I mean, Idaho has a pretty high per capita prison population, and I'm not a big fan of that either. I question why that exists. And so then women and minority groups tend to be the ones that are disproportionately affected by the carceral state. I question a lot of petty offenses, and a lot of the things. I also question a lot of things that slip by. So you also mentioned, assault, and sexual assault in particular, and that is we talked about gun violence being a difficult subject. I mean, sexual assault is an incredibly difficult one, and one that probably affects more people directly. I have family members who have been affected by it. And from what I've seen, it's not just that we don't take it seriously enough as a culture. It's that our systems that we use to detect and prevent and punish these instances of sexual assault are not robust enough. They're not staffed adequately. They're not funded adequately. The rules for how people can operate within these structures are not conducive to people's lived experiences. And I'm realizing it's hard for me to get into specifics without talking about people that I know personally, and so that's actually kind of troubling. it's hard for me to come up with like a specific solution, except to say that I am very aware of a lot of the problems that people are facing. I've had people reach out to my campaign and that I've known personally, specifically because they wanted to talk about these issues and where the system has failed them. And I think that that is a very long conversation to have, one that we need to have, and one that we need to make sure that women are leading the conversation on that, because they're the victims. Women and children are the victims, and we need to be doing what we can to let them advocate for themselves and give them the platform they need, because you're asking the people who've been hurt by a system to be the champions of their own justice.
Yeah.
And they should be, but you're also asking them to do it from a position of disadvantage. So they're not capable always of being their own advocates. And it's a very difficult balance, but one that we're not even trying to find right now.
Yeah, and I do like that you mentioned the judicial system failing, because when I think of the specific stories that have been brought to me of just complete suffering, it's watching the abuser just get a slap on the wrist. And
Yeah.
so I think that is probably the biggest injustice feeling, where all that passion comes from. Not the biggest, but a very major concern. So just knowing that you have attention and personal connections to, I mean, I think we all do. I saw a statistic that said like 1 in 3 women that you meet are going to have some experience with this. And so that's why I did want to bring it up today. And I do appreciate that it deserves a long conversation. But I just wanted to ask you kind of just if it's something that you care about and something that you're paying attention to.
Yeah. Well, and I guess the other thing too is like, there's the specific direct conversations of how do you deal with these things as they've happened. And then there's the larger macro systemic part of the problem. And as a socialist, I always tend to lean towards the systemic side of it. And so, you know, for example, right, if you're talking about a situation where you have a woman who's being abused by her spouse, why doesn't she leave? And there are a lot of answers to that question, a lot of valid answers to that question. So for one, I mean, like, what if they have a child? And then they're worried about childcare and child safety. Do they have a job outside of the home? Or is that part of the cycle of abuse, is that they're not allowed to work outside of the home? Do they have the means of taking care of themselves? Are they going to go to a women's shelter? Is there one in their community? Is there one that's funded and actually has beds available, right? And so these are things that when you start to focus on things like just the overall standard of living for women and working women in particular, right? If they have access to education, jobs, healthcare, the things that allow them to be more self-sustaining, you see a decrease in domestic abuse. Not because it doesn't happen, but because they're empowered to handle it. They can deal with it. They're not afraid. They have resources. They have, you know, the ability to fend for themselves in a way that a lot of women in abusive cycles are not able to. And so you have to do what you can in the existing system to fend for those who are powerless. But you also need to understand that they're powerless in that position largely for reasons that may be outside of their control. You know, and we tend to focus this as an individual failure. Well, if you just hadn't married him, if you just hadn't stayed, and it's like, no. Why did those things happen? Why did the deck of cards of your life deal you this hand? And what options did you have to deal with what you were dealt? And if we find that you didn't have any and you ended up in this circumstance, whose fault is that? Well, obviously the abuser, but also society, because we let people, our people, fall into a set of circumstances where the odds of them falling into an abusive cycle were high. And, you know, there's no one-size-fits-all answer to this. Mm-hmm. But when you start dealing with addressing social programs and social needs of a population, you start to see not just with like domestic abuse and like, you know, abuse of women, but like all of these different groups, like children, minorities, you know, even men who are abused by the same system, but just in different ways. All of these things start to drop because you're empowering people to fight for themselves and make the most of their own circumstances and allowing them the freedom to choose how to do that in the best way that's suitable for them.
Okay. Well, thank you for answering that question, giving respect to that. Let's talk about military. We're talking about foreign wars, service members, our Idaho military and foreign wars, possibly. In fact, I'm going to go over and protest the strikes of Venezuela. You know, we got a lot of foreign wars going on, and we also have the National Guard operating in cities. Just, you know, DC we have, and then I think it was like Chicago or whatever. I forget all of the ones where they've mobilized the National Guard. We have National Guard troops here supporting ICE, and I know there's been some that's not something new, but we do have a lot of people here, even at the Mountain Home Air Force Base, who I've talked to, who have concerns about things being out of their hands and being afraid to be put in positions they're not comfortable in. And we also have the situations with veteran care right now, where veterans are kind of just being forgotten and they're not being supported. And they're still around. We still have people who are suffering from the outcomes of napalm and all Agent Orange and our time in Vietnam. So can you tell us a little bit about what your thoughts are on all that?
Yeah, well, I would say first of all, so I come from a military family. My brother has served. My father was in the Army. He was in the 10th Mountain Division. My grandfather was in Vietnam. I had looked at joining the military at one point, and because of my status as a transgender individual, I have multiple times run into that roadblock. I come at this with some nuance because I am not one of the kinds of people that says that there's no need for a military or that we shouldn't necessarily use our military. But obviously, I have some problems with how we're using our National Guard. I've already said that I'm against ICE. I want to abolish ICE. I think that any kind of cooperation with ICE or with the current regime of federal law enforcement and the way things are being handled is a crime. And look, it's true, like the federal government does have abilities to come in and nationalize or federalize the National Guard. There are things that they can do, but that doesn't mean that you can't fight it, that you can't take it to the courts. And some governors are doing that. Ours is not one of them. So as far as our National Guard being used in this kind of law enforcement, I would be absolutely against it. I would also be against things like, hey, there's an immigration issue down at the border of Texas. Let's go send our guys down there for a quick photo op. That's not impressive to me. I think it is a huge disservice to our service members. It's not the mission that they signed up for. It is a violation of trust. It is not the kind of commandership that I would expect. And I think we should all be very disturbed by things like that. If I were going to use the National Guard as governor, it would be for the same basics you would always use them for, things like emergencies, like natural disasters, right? The hurricanes last year that hit the southeast United States, that's a perfect example of where we maybe should be sending our Guard to assist with other state operations. These are things where, to my knowledge, like some of the local Guard units were literally underwater and they needed help just to get things established so that they could do their missions. That's obviously something that we should support. I'm typically rather hesitant to our National Guard in Idaho actually deploys overseas a lot. Sometimes that's necessary. And I do think that there's a case to be made for that. But that being said, I don't think that we're doing enough to take care of our National Guardsmen, regardless of branch of service. Idaho, like a lot of conservative states, has this habit. There's a set number of days where if you are deployed for a federal mission, you are entitled to federal benefits as a service member in the National Guard. So what we'll do, and what a lot of other conservative states do, is we'll just deploy them for a couple days less than that, and then recall them home, and then send them out again. And so it resets the clock. So our Guardsmen never get those benefits that they should be entitled to, because we're effectively, we're cheating the system to cheat them of those benefits. If we're going to ask our National Guardsmen to deploy to dangerous missions, particularly overseas in places where they might be doing things that the public doesn't know about, but that maybe need to be done, we should at the very least be making sure that they're taken care of in the most basic of ways. And we're just not doing that. Talking about using the Guard, stateside, like here in Idaho, I've thought about, Trump has talked a lot about, like, we're sending the Guard to take care of lawlessness and problems in all these different cities. I'm not a fan of that, but I would say, let's up the ante. If we're capable, and we saw this during COVID, we had Guard units respond and create like field hospitals and, things that it was an emergency situation and we needed infrastructure developed like that, things that we do overseas all the time. If we can go empire build in other nations, why don't we use the Guard to actually help out with problems here? And that is a mission that I do think a lot of Guardsmen would support. Things like, hey, we know that we have a serious problem with homelessness in this state. And I say homelessness, not houselessness, because I'm not about to try and gentrify the problem. These people are living on the streets. I'm not going to call it homelessness, because if only they had a home. And then you picture the idyllic image of like a warm hearth and you know, a blanket and a cup of hot chocolate. That's not what I'm talking about. These people don't have a place to live. They're homeless. If we can acknowledge that that's a problem, and if we can acknowledge that our current resources are not capable of keeping up, why not use the resources we have? So like the social workers, the nonprofits, right? Like I remember I was living in the Boise area when the Cooper Court issue happened, right? Like, so the area by the Interfaith Sanctuary, right? You had, there's the courtyard where you were only allowed to be in the shelter during certain hours, and then they kick everybody out because there's no, you know, regulations. They have to do that. And so then they're camped out in the courtyard until they're able to go back inside again. And instead of seeing that as an abysmal logistics failure, we saw that as those are people that are defacing the character of our community and hurting property values, and we need to rough them up and get them out of town. That is completely the opposite of what we should be doing. If you have a situation like that where you know that the people trying to solve the problem, like the sanctuary, are not, they don't have the resources in order to do this, that, in my opinion, is one where maybe the guard can come in and say, hey, we've built up a bunch of, like, you know, we've set up a camp, we've set up a structure, we've got beds available, we're going to work with the nonprofit. You know, what resources can we provide? Like, can we provide food? Can we set up field hospitals? Can we set up kitchens? Can we provide access to social workers so that these people are able to get medical care, so that they're able to get, if needed, psychiatric care? Because even if you don't have mental illness that leads to you becoming homeless, though that's very common, you're probably going to develop some mental illness when you've had a few nights out on the street, because it happens. Finding the access to care that these people need, and then ideally, like, helping them get established. Like, hey, like, let's try and find you affordable housing. Let's try and find you a job, and do it on a voluntary basis. We're not going to come in and grab you and force you to go through this, but we'll use the guard to create that infrastructure with civilian leadership and oversight, using the nonprofits and social workers and groups that are already there to provide that care, bolstering their capabilities as they see fit, and assisting them in their mission with the guard. One, that takes care of a major issue. And that's not the only issue I can think of that we could do that with, but like, that's the one that comes to mind. And two, like, if we're going to use our guard at all, those are the kinds of missions that I think we should use them for. Not photo ops for dictators, not harassing people with more skin tone than me, you know, but actually doing things that benefit the communities in Idaho that they signed up to serve.
It's not just patrolling the streets with guns and pairs, but actually I
Exactly.
have an image of that, but I also have an image of, which you just brought to my mind, you know, the guards setting up tents, handing out food,
Oh, yeah.
you know, handing out blankets, like being the ones that can approach people on the streets, but just giving them a hand. And it's not something I thought of before, but I mean, those are the kind of ideas that...
If we're going to have this strong military apparatus, and there are arguments to be made for and against that, but if we're going to have it, shouldn't we at least use it creatively to benefit the people that they're supposed to be serving, rather than just causing bedlam and mayhem?
And it kind of changes the stigma about what's going on with the military right now, and see National
Exactly.
Guard troops on the streets. It just,
Yeah.
You know, okay, perfect. All right. To move on to talk about workers, you were talking about paid family leave and focusing on remote work. Can you talk on that?
Yeah. So paid family leave. So in the same sense that, like, you know, a mother who has a child might have access to maternity leave, I think that we should just have as a statewide benefit full family leave. So whether you're the mother, the father, an adopted family, right, you have the ability to take paid family leave to be with your child as you start your family or add on to your family. And then as far as the Telework initiative, that's what you mentioned?
Yeah.
Yeah, so as far as that's concerned, I think that we actually have a lot of infrastructure for this already that we built years ago that we're not really using for, like, greater broadband access. I think that we should increase that even further. I think that we should, culturally, we should advocate for this, but also, like, statewide. Like, if you're working in state government and your job can be done remotely, I think we should advocate for that. It makes sense. It's something where, you know, you talk about, like, managing growth and, like, hiring people and trying to fit them all into office spaces. It makes a lot of sense to do that. But also creating incentives and advocating for, like, even in the private sector, if you have a job that can be done from home, we should be creating incentives to transition to a work culture where that is more and more the norm of being able to work from home in those kinds of jobs than still having to come into the office every day. One, I think because it can be optional. I'm not saying we mandate it and like people who don't like working from home have to do it. That's not what I'm saying. But making sure that it's an availability and it's technologically possible, that we have the right broadband infrastructure to accommodate it, because I think there's a lot of benefits to it as well. People aren't spending as much on transportation. It's then it has a knock-on effect for like traffic congestion in urban areas. You start to get into some creative things too, where like if you look at your downtowns, you've got office buildings, and then you have all of the businesses that accommodate the people who work in those buildings. Well, if you're decentralizing by having people working from home and you're making that a priority, you get into a lot of really interesting conversations about what our cities look like. And when we're talking about how Idaho is growing really rapidly and we're not really doing enough to accommodate that, this gives us another tool in the toolbox to try and accommodate that growth and develop our cities and our rural areas, because they're growing too, in a way that we think is best. We get to decide. And it's not just the typical model of big city, big downtown, lots of traffic, and like there's a bunch of boutiques and restaurants downtown that everyone has to go to. We actually get to be maybe a little bit more pioneering with our urban planning and design if we lean into policies that shake up that structure of like traffic patterns and where people want to be and when.
So aside from workers, add the words. A lot of people don't even know what that means, but I know on your page you said you support that. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, so I think it's about a decade ago now, which that's alarming. There was a campaign to add the words gender identity and sexual orientation to the Idaho Bill of Human Rights. That's our state level anti-discrimination law. So the federal level, we have that. So things like the Civil Rights Act, or like all of the different workplace anti-discrimination laws. There's a lot of case law. But when the federal level has a gap, it then goes down to the state level. So some states are more proactive. So states like California, for example, do have provisions for gender identity and sexuality. And so that means whether it's your workplace or whether you're a tenant renting from a landlord for your apartment, you are not able to be discriminated against by those factors the same way that you can't be discriminated against for the color of your skin or your ethnic origin or your religion. Protected classes, right? Idaho does not have any such state level protections, which means that for gender identity and sexual orientation, you are at the mercy of whatever interpretation the current president of the United States has for how those laws should be carried out. By adding the words to the Idaho Bill of Human Rights, you create protections for those people who are currently, I'm not saying it's completely legal to discriminate, but it's a lot harder to prove that they're being discriminated against, and they are not protected in those same ways.
Okay. All right, and then just a couple more things. We are talking about term limits as well. I know you mentioned you support term limits. Can you tell us a little bit more about your theory there?
Yeah, so Idaho actually did used to have term limits at one point for state office. We don't have them anymore. I'm proposing effectively mirroring what we have for the federal level in terms of like the governor. So right now, like if Brad Little wins this election, this will be his third term in office. I don't think that should be a thing. I think that the governor should have 2 lifetime terms, the same way the president of the United States has 2 lifetime terms, consecutive or non-consecutive. But I also think that we should add term limits to our state legislature as well, for the equivalent of basically being like, regardless of what state office you're in, no more than 8 years, however those terms break out, no more than 8 years in office, consecutive or non-consecutive.
Okay, and what would that mean for people who are currently in office?
Well, I think that Idaho, just like our national level politics, has a problem with politicians who have been in the game for way too long. And look, I've been in public service for 12 years now. For me, I'm very proud of the work I do as a public servant. I will probably continue it as long as I can. But if Social Security still exists for me at age 62 and a half, when I can draw it in early, I'm going to do that. And if I'm still working in some kind of large public capacity by that point, either I found something where I can, kind of sit on the sidelines and advise and teach the next generation, or I've done something very wrong. Not just financially, but like I may have sold my soul by then. And so I think when you've got politicians that are in their 70s and 80s or pushing 90 in some cases, and they're still in elected office, and they're still preventing the next generation from taking the reins of power, they're still making policies that they will never see the benefit from because they won't live long enough. I think you really need to question why somebody like that would stay in office and who they might owe favors to that make it difficult for them to not seek re-election. So what does it do for the Idaho voter? Look, it forces us to actually choose new leadership on a regular timetable. Because if you can't keep running forever, and maybe you run for office, you do your terms, and then you do a different office and do the term limits there, that's fine. I think having a career in public service is an honorable and noble thing. I don't want to take that away from anyone. But I don't think you should be able to hoard one particular office or one set of powers in our system to yourself until you decide that you don't want to run for re-election anymore. And term limits would prevent that from happening.
Excellent. Okay, well, you've taken a lot of time sitting down here with me, and I super, super, super appreciate it. And there's a lot of topics we covered, and I hope to be able to do another interview with you again.
Absolutely, yeah.
I guess my last question is, what is the biggest need for your campaign right now? Like, where are you? What help do you need? What support? What resources for anyone that has taken an interest to your campaign, has looked on your website, agrees with your values? Where can they show up?
Yeah, absolutely. So I would say first and foremost, check out durandforidaho.com. That's our website. All of our stuff is there. Events, we have a volunteer form if you want to volunteer. We do need specific things, so like door knocking, phone banking. We need artists. We need people who can do social media and video production. We have some of that, but we don't have enough of them, so we've got a bit of a bottleneck with our production schedule. And then the biggest thing, and I hate it because it sounds cliche, but like we need donations. I'm not taking any money from PACs. Especially, we've had a lot of questions about whether or not I'll take money from APAC. Absolutely not, for a lot of reasons. But also, like, we're not taking any corporate or PAC money. Now, if we get one like an environmental group or something, we'll have that discussion. But I'm genuinely leaning towards just not taking any of that money at all. I don't like the strings attached. I don't like what it does to campaigns. I don't think it's right for Idaho. But that also means that we are completely dependent on small individual donors, the people who are frankly the least able to give, and I am once again asking for their financial support. Our average donation right now is $54, I believe. It fluctuates a little bit. We've had a couple of larger, people have donated a few $100, and that's been incredibly gracious of them. But for the amount of support that we're seeing online and people who come up to me in person and say, hey, I love what you're doing, if every one of those people gave us a couple of bucks, I would not be worried about fundraising.
Okay. All right. Well, Maxine, I hope to see you around, and thank you again for this interview. I found it very insightful. I do support your campaign. All the things that we talked about today really align with the values, and I've grown up here, spent my whole life here. I have a lot of hope for someone like you getting into office and representing those of us down here who just need somebody to be in there as a voice and to be paying attention to all these things that we can't always be paying attention to down here. So again, thank you for showing up and just doing this interview for me.
Yeah.
And wish you the best of luck in your
Absolutely.
campaign.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you for having me.